Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Lieben, and I work with IRMA in the Risk Management and Training Department. Today, the Public Works Steering Committee would like to present the tree risk management program that we were originally offering through our Public Works Steering Committee meeting that was canceled due to COVID-19. John Carlson is our tree risk management consultant that will be presenting for the day. Just a few housekeeping. Right now with this webinar, if you do have any questions during John's presentation, there's a Q&A button that you can hit and we will monitor it throughout the presentation, and John will be able to answer questions as they come in or pausing throughout the presentation to reply to your questions. All questions will be answered, and if we do need to follow up with an email, we will do so. Also, there was a mention of CEUs that will be available upon completion of this course, and at the end of the presentation, I will give direction on how those will be achieved. At this point, I'd like to introduce John, who will start our presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Lisa. I work for Great Lakes Urban Forestry Management, and we do a lot of work for municipalities, park districts, and a lot of risk management consulting work. And so I hope I can give you some information today that might help you understand how you can actually manage risk that your urban forest might pose. I've worked as a superintendent of parks for many years, and I was the urban forester for a park district, and I also worked for the city of Colorado Springs. So I have some background in working in the public sector, so I hope I can understand the problems and the perspective that you may have. So let's get started here. I have a lot of information. It's a broad overview of tree risk management, but I hope I can get some things across that might give you some practical steps that you can take. So first, let's talk about an example that I want to give with my experience in Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs, if you've been there, is nestled at the base of Pikes Peak. They're known for their 300 sunny days a year, beautiful weather. But it was on one of those beautiful June days. It was a Sunday morning. It was about 72 degrees, mild winds. And the fire department gets a call. A tree in the right-of-way had come down. It was on West Colorado Avenue, which is an arterial going into downtown Colorado Springs. The tree had fallen onto a bus stop bench. And on that bus stop bench were two gentlemen, and they were pinned underneath this tree. This is a large 33-inch silver maple. And there were some bystanders there that were trying to help the gentleman, and the tree, of course, was too heavy to lift. And so the fire department arrived and was able to lift the tree, extricate the men, and get them to a hospital. Fortunately, they lived, but they did have some serious injuries. So the question we're going to address here is, could this have been predicted? And we're going to come back to that question. But first of all, I want to talk about you guys in IRMA, and I know we have some PDIRMA members here too, so this applies to you also. Let's look at some IRMA members' logos. What's the thing in common that you see on these logos? Trees, right? Trees, leaves, forests. And why is that? If it's on your logo, it has to be very important to the community, right? So trees are, the urban forest is very important to most communities, and especially to you guys, I can see by your logos. I'm just going to briefly talk about the benefits of trees. You could do a whole seminar on this, of course. But of course, the urban forest reduces the heat island effect. It increases oxygen levels for your community. It collects air pollutants. Property values are actually increased. And with all these points, there have been numerous studies that have shown these things. Energy costs are lowered. They actually reduce stormwater runoff, which is very important for communities. Business opportunities increase and crime rates are lowered. Some other intangible benefits are that trees and a healthy urban forest can increase a sense of community. It gives people a connection with the natural world, and it helps. Actually, studies have found that the healthy urban forest actually helps to heal mental and physical ailments, and trees just tend to bring people together. And I think that's why people value trees in their communities. There's something called iTree that you can take your tree inventory, if you have one, you can plug in the information, and it gives you actually quantifiable benefits that you get from your urban forest. We're not going to go into this, but just the point is that you actually have quantifiable benefits that you get from your urban forest. So it almost goes without saying that the bigger the tree, the bigger the benefit, right? But also the higher the risk. And that can be easily seen. You look at the tree on the left compared to the tree on the right. The tree on the right provides a lot of benefit for that shady street, but also because of its size, height, trunk diameter, limb diameter, and height, you have a higher risk with that tree. So let's look at management objectives for tree risk. What you're really trying to do is balance the risks that trees may pose against the benefits that you derive from those trees. Of course, you're going to eliminate risk if you don't have any trees, but you get so many benefits from your healthy urban forest that you want to retain as much of that urban forest as you can. And we all need to understand that any tree can fail under enough load. A load is wind combined with rain, snow, sleet, ice, but especially wind produces load on a tree. And even a perfectly healthy tree can fail under enough load. So to properly manage your trees, you as managers should have a basic knowledge of what potential risks to people and property there are in your urban forest. Now the good news is that serious injury and death from tree failure is relatively uncommon. But you as IRMA and PRODERMA members are concerned with being proactive in your risk management. So I would think this would be of some interest to you. So what's tree risk management? It's really the combination of the application of policies, procedures, and practices in order to identify, evaluate, mitigate, monitor, and communicate your risk from trees. So first, let's talk about some risk. Here's two terms, hazard tree versus tree risk. Hazard tree is a term that's been used quite a bit. It's actually older terminology now, but I'm sure many of you have tree ordinances that have this term hazard tree in the ordinance. Hazard is actually the tree or the part of the tree that might fail in the tree. Really, what we're really looking at is risk you might have from trees. And so it's the tree or tree part that might fail combined with the consequence of that failure. And that's what risk is. And so it's just a little more accurate to describe this as managing tree risk as opposed to managing hazard trees. So what's risk as it relates to trees? It's these things combined. The likelihood of a tree or a tree part, like a branch or limb, failing, so breaking off and falling to the ground, combined with the likelihood of that failure affecting the target. So what's a target? A target is a person or property, piece of property, and the severity of the consequences of that failure. So either injury or death, property damage, or actually disruption of services is a consequence too. If you think about it, tree coming down, bringing down power lines, or falling into a main street, that disrupts services. So that's actually a consequence of tree failure. So what's tree risk assessment? It's a systematic process that identifies, analyzes, and evaluates risk. It's done by trained professional tree risk assessors. And what they do is they can determine a risk level for an individual tree and give options that mitigate that risk for that tree and also give you residual risk. We'll talk more about these things in more detail later. What tree risk assessment is not, it's not a professional coming in and telling you to remove or retain a tree. And that might sound kind of counterintuitive if you hire a tree care company, a tree risk assessor to come in and evaluate your risk. You're going to maybe say, well, why aren't you telling me what to do? Well, what they're really going to do is give you recommendations on what your options are, because there's always options. You can always do nothing. You can remove the tree. You can do other mitigation options. And so they're going to give you advice and options on what you can do, and then you can take that information and you can make the decision that's best for you and your community. And really, I'm just trying to stress the point that you as tree managers are the ones that actually make the decisions on what to do with your urban forest. So, what are your responsibilities? Isn't a tree or branch falling known as an act of God? We've all heard that term before. So what's an act of God definition? Here it is. An accident or event resulting from natural causes without human intervention or agency, and one that could not have been prevented by reasonable foresight or care. For example, floods, lightning, earthquake, or storms. Now take a note of the phrase, could not have been prevented by reasonable foresight or care. We're going to be looking a little more closely at that as we go through the presentation. So back to Colorado Springs. This tree, like I said, was a 33-inch silver maple, arterial, going downtown. The city foresters drove by this tree several times during the week. This tree was showing signs of decline. There were some deadwood in the top of it. Didn't appear to be thriving and healthy. So the question is, was this an act of God? Is this something that could not have been prevented by reasonable foresight or care? Again, we're going to keep coming back to this example. So, why do we manage risk? Liability, right? You know, that's one of the first things that come to mind. You want to protect your agency. CYA. You know, being in the position that many of you are in, I know it was no fun to have the boss say, hey, there's a reporter I want you to talk to about this incident that happened, or that the mayor has to go before the press and talk about this situation. It's just, it's not very much fun. But really, why do we manage risk? And you as members of PDRMA and IRMA, it's the right thing to do. You're proactive in your risk management. It creates a better community for your constituents, and you can take pride in your job because you know you're doing the best you can for the people that you serve. So let's talk about the risk management process. This is really the nuts and bolts of the presentation here. So how do we manage tree risk? These are the points I'm going to be bringing up. I'm going to keep coming back to them. This is an overview. So the first thing you really want to do is create a tree risk management policy, and then you're going to identify potential tree risk in the urban forest. Then you may conduct higher levels of risk assessment on individual trees where it's appropriate, and then you'll identify and prioritize risk mitigation actions that would come from those assessments. You're going to develop a plan, and then you're going to implement that plan as you're able to with the resources that you're allotted. And I think coming from having a risk management background as a safety coordinator too, but also as a manager in a municipality, I understand that resources aren't unlimited, and you have to be able to implement a plan in a prioritized manner. So let's talk about tree risk policy. You, of course, have lots of policies and procedures. You probably have a thick book on policies. And one of the reasons why we're emphasizing creating a tree risk policy is it's the platform you're going to work from to have a risk management program for your urban forest. It's going to be the basis from what you do everything from, and it's going to state, it'll bring into, it'll state your minimum standards that you're going to adhere to. What does the boss always say when something happens? He says, well, did we follow our policy? What does our policy say? And so if you have a tree risk policy, you can go back to that and you can make sure that you're following that policy to do the best that you can to manage your risk. So the policy is going to show that you intend to make efforts to identify and manage potential risk, and it's going to outline how you intend to do that. And this, of course, can be incorporated into your existing risk management policies and procedures. And if you have an urban forestry management plan, it should be incorporated into that also. So, how do you identify tree risk? Here's some acronyms. The International Society of Arboriculture has come up with best management practices in TRAQ, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. So tree risk assessment is a systematic process, and it's actually based on ANSI standard. It's ANSI A300 Part 9 standards that lay all of this that I'm talking to. It lays it all out. And the BMPs that ISA has developed are all based on these ANSI A300 standards. So this process is used by trained arborists to identify risk and analyze and evaluate that risk. And so it's actually evaluated by categorizing the likelihood of a tree or tree part failure and the severity of the consequences from that failure. And this is a qualitative assessment, meaning it's not qualitative. We're not assigning numbers to certain types of trees and certain types of defects. What we're doing is we're doing a qualitative assessment. So we're giving a rating to the likelihood of failure and the associated consequences. And we come up with a risk level for an individual tree. And then you as managers have risk levels, and then we can make recommendations based on those risk levels on how you can mitigate that risk. So it doesn't require perfection, and it's not perfect because we're dealing with living organisms that change over time. And but it's the best system that we have that can evaluate potential risk in the urban forest. Here's the assessment levels that we have in TRAQ. There's level 1, 2, and 3. The first one is the basic, or is a limited visual assessment, and I'll go over all these in the upcoming slides. Level 2 is a basic assessment. Level 3 is an advanced assessment. Each level increases in its analysis and detail of risk in trees. And these are all based, again, on the ANSI standards. So first, level 1, limited visual assessment. This type of assessment is intended for identifying potential risk in larger populations of trees. And this is what you as managers of the urban forest have to deal with, either in parks, parkways, medians, or other municipal properties. You're dealing with a population of trees, not just an individual tree here and there. And the level 1 assessment deals with large populations of trees and assessing risk in populations of trees. A level 1 assessment is actually like a screening process or like a safety audit for the tree population. It identifies trees having an imminent or probable likelihood of structural failure. And I'll define those terms in a second here. It's done just like an inventory. It's a ground level walk by from one or more sides of the tree, and the arborist is looking for above ground structural defects like a dead tree, standing dead tree, cavity openings, dead, broken branches, hung up branches, fungal fruiting structures, large cracks, severe leans, and other things. And usually what you do too is you define the parameters of the level 1 assessment. Usually what you say is it's trees, city trees or village trees over 12 inches in trunk diameter and for this time period. The reason why you give a size is that once you get underneath that 12-inch trunk diameter, the trees are not as big, not as high. They're not really posing that much risk to people and property. And the reason why you define a time period, you say this assessment is for the next 2 years, because you don't want to have it open-ended because trees change over time. You don't want to have it too short because then it's not practical. So what you're doing is you're evaluating a tree as to whether a park can fail within this 1 to 2 year time frame. So getting back to imminent and probable failure, as defined in the BMP, imminent means the failure has started or is likely, most likely to occur really in the near future. It's usually when it's already occurring. And one of the ways other arborists and I help ourselves to define imminent is, if we're afraid to walk underneath it, like on the right there, I would not walk under that broken top. We define it as imminent. Probable likelihood of failure means that it's probably going to fail in the next 1 to 2 years. We would expect that dead limb or that part of the tree or that tree to fail within that time frame that we've defined. And we do say under normal weather conditions. What that means is normal weather conditions for the upper Midwest, which is heat, cold, wind, rain, wind gusts 50 miles an hour, snow. Wind shear and tornadoes are not considered normal weather conditions. So one way to have a level 1 assessment done is through a comprehensive tree inventory. Because when you're doing a GIS-based inventory, you're gathering information on all these tree points here. And each point has information that's put into it as far as the genus, species, size, trunk diameter, health of the tree, defects that are found in the tree. And so you're gathering that information that's collected in a level 1 assessment. But not everybody can have an inventory done. They take a lot of time. They cost money. You can only have them done every few years because of limited resources. It'd be great to do it every other year, but you can't do that. And some agencies maybe haven't even been able to do it because of the cost. You actually can do a level 1 tree risk assessment as a standalone task. You hire an arborist to just do a level 1 assessment on those trees 12 inches and over in your maintained areas of rights of ways and parks, let's say, or village properties. And they can, and it's much cheaper because it takes much less time. So what's the arborist looking for? Like I said, they're looking for dead branches, hangers. Hangers are branches that are broken off and stuck in the tree. Sometimes they call them widow makers. Dead trees, cracks, weak branch unions, decay, root problems, cankers. We're going to look at a few of these things. Let's look at dead limbs and hangers. On the left, you see the hanger there? Yeah, that's a big hanger. This was actually at an outdoor education center. Another arborist and I were doing a level 1 assessment. And we came up to this tree, and this was definitely one we were not going to walk underneath. And we actually contacted the manager, and we recommended that they barricade tape it to keep anyone from going underneath that till they could get an aerial lift in there and get that limb down. On the right there, you can see an oak that had a limb fail, a dead limb. Now, I just want to emphasize that dead limbs will fail. It's inevitable, but you can't predict when they're going to fail. If you look at this oak tree here, this limb still had bark on it. Sometimes these limbs hang on for years and years and years, and sometimes, and you just don't know when they're going to fall. And so that's not something we can really predict, is exactly when something like that will fall, but it should be known. Dead trees, of course. On the right there, you can see that dead leaning tree. When that fails, it's going to be on the street. And so that's something that could pose risk. The tree on the left is a tall dead oak. It's actually leaning away from the street, but it's leaning towards a parking lot. So that also poses some risk. Cracked trunks and limbs. You can see here from the top to the bottom, this tree and trunk has a split in it going all the way through the trunk, severely reducing the strength in that trunk. Here's another example. This one's harder to see. This one is not as obvious, but you look at that trunk high in the tree, you see there, look a little closer, there's actually a large crack in the top of that tree. Difficult to say the depth of that crack. This is where you need an aerial lift and inspection to see actually how severe that defect is. Included bark. If you look at the arrow on the right there, that's the branch union there is very narrow, very V-shaped, right? And what that does is it prevents solid wood growing in the union. What happens is the bark stays in place, and that's called included bark. So there's always bark between those branches in their union, and as they grow larger and larger, it can cause stress on that union. You can see this tree on the right has actually cracked on the trunk because of that. The one on the left has actually failed because of that included bark and that weak union. Decay. These are a couple obvious signs of decay. Cavities. Now, just so you know, all trees have decay and have to fight off decay. Healthy trees normally can fight off decay by compartmentalizing decay organisms when they enter through a wound. Usually they'll seal off the xylem, the wood, and they'll be able to contain that decay into just that portion of that tree so it doesn't spread into the heartwood of that tree. But trees can have repeated injury and can have some health issues, and that's when you have problems with decay. Here's some indicators of decay. Decay is caused by fungal organisms, and the fruiting bodies are mushrooms, as you see on the right here. Here you have some basal decay with some fruiting bodies, mushrooms. In the middle, you have a conch, which is a fruiting body of a fungal organism that's causing some heartwood decay. On the left, you have a fungal mat underneath the bark of this white oak tree. It's actually shoestring rot, and another sign of decay, fungal decay. Failure due to decay, of course, can be catastrophic. We've all seen these types of tree failures. One thing to especially look out for is basal root decay. If you look at the tree on the left, you see how that tree is decayed. About 40% of the base of the tree has no roots supporting it. This tree was in a golf course I was assessing, and I was actually leaning over the cart path near the tee. And so this is a large white oak, and you don't want to have that fail like the one on the right, because the one on the right had the same issue. You can see on the part that failed on the top, there was nothing holding that. So that's one thing we look for also. Cankers. Cankers are an open wound that doesn't heal. You can see in this tree has been trying to outgrow that canker. There's some response wood on the right side here trying to outgrow it, but the various microorganisms that cause cankers are growing faster than the tree can outgrow it. So cankers can affect the structural integrity of the trunk also. Let's talk about level 2 and level 3 assessments. Now, if you remember, level 1 assessments are for populations of trees. It's a screening system to define trees with imminent or probable likelihoods of failure. Level 2 and level 3 assessments are assessments on individual trees, and you might find these trees in your level 1 assessment, and it's a valuable tree that has some value to your municipality that you want to make sure that you're making the right decision before you just go and take that large oak tree down. And it doesn't appear to be imminent or probable, but is there enough risk that you should maybe do some sort of mitigation on that tree? You can see in the tree on the left here, it's a large oak tree with a pretty good lean to it. You can see some odd growth around the trunk, some swelling around the trunk. Sometimes that indicates some interior decay. So these arborists are actually doing a check on this tree as to the decay in the internal structure of the tree. So it's used for more valuable trees that you're not able to determine whether the decay or the problem is severe enough to warrant removal. So a level 2 assessment is a basic tree assessment, and it's a ground level assessment by an arborist. They use some simple tools and techniques. You can see the arborist on the right here using a sounding mallet to determine the sound when he hits the trunk of the tree. You can tell the levels of decay that may be in the trunk. They inspect the tree for its targets, potential targets in the target zone. We'll talk about this in a minute. They'll inspect the tree visually from the ground. They'll review site history, conditions around the tree. They also look at the species, because certain species are more prone to failure than others. They'll review site history, failure history of the tree. They'll look at potential tree loads. They'll look at the general health of the tree, and they'll record all their observations. Level 3 is an advanced assessment. Level 3 assessment uses specialized tools, as you can see in the pictures here, and techniques to give you an idea of the extent of the defect in the tree. Some of the things that are utilized are drones, climbers get in the tree, or using an aerial lift. Decay testing is done using sonic tomography or a resistance drill. Sonic tomography, as you can see on the left there, is actually a system of using sound waves to measure the amount of decay in a tree. If you remember in your physics class, sound waves travel faster through denser materials. So the sound waves will travel faster through good wood and slower through decayed wood or through a cavity. And so that's measured, and the level of decay is measured. A resistance drill actually drills a needle into the trunk, and it measures the amount of resistance in the sound wood versus the decayed wood. And so you can measure the amount of sound wood around the trunk of the tree. The arborist will also do detailed target analysis. We'll do property values and occupation rate analysis, detailed site evaluations. They'll evaluate the health of the tree. They also might look at the roots and the root colors. They can take a compressed air and blow away the soil so you're not hurting the roots, and you can examine the roots and see if there's decay in that root, in the root collar or the roots. They can test for wind load, and they can also measure changes in trunk lean over time. So these advanced assessments, and remember, they're on individual trees, so they produce a risk level for that individual tree. What you end up with is a risk level based on the likelihood of the failure, combined with the likelihood of that failure impacting a target. What's a target? It's a person or property, right? And combined with the severity of the consequences of the failure impact. So where these three things intersect is where you come up with a risk level of low, moderate, high, and extreme. So first, let's define likelihood of failure. Now, you're not going to have to remember all these terms. This is what the arborist does, and the arborists are trained in this. But I just wanted to show you this, to show you the process and give you an understanding of how this is done. So likelihood of failure, improbable, it's probably not going to fail. Possible, it could occur, and remember we're talking about it within a time frame. Failure could occur, but it's not likely. Probable, like I said, we define these terms. It may be expected. Imminent, you don't want to walk underneath it. So remember, this is under a defined time frame under normal weather conditions. So if you're talking about impact, it has to impact something, a target, right? So people or property. So what are your targets? Here's a street scene. What are the targets in this picture? We've got cars on the street, people in the cars. You'll have parked cars, people in the parked cars, bikes on the street. You'll have people on the sidewalk. And then look on the other side of the bike there. You have two benches. You have people that are going to sit on those benches underneath that large tree. You have the benches themselves that are targets. About municipal properties and municipal buildings, the entrances to those buildings, the access to those properties, the amenities that are on those properties, all of those things are targets. All gathering places on your public properties. gazebos, picnic shelters, amphitheaters, playgrounds, river walks. All of these things draw people and bring targets into the area. Special facilities such as golf courses. Golf courses typically like to keep large trees when they're developed because it just adds to the aesthetics of the course. So remember, for there to be risk, you have to have a target, meaning people or property. The philosophical question of if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it really produce a sound? Well, the corollary in the risk assessment is if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there, is there any risk? Well, no, there isn't actually. But if there's a pathway underneath that tree, there is some potential risk, right? Because people walk on the pathway. Let's talk about target zones. So you need to determine the target zone. Target zone is where the tree or tree part will fall and impact. So if it's a limb, it's going to impact in the drip line, which means the width of the canopy. Here, the canopy width is delineated with with post and chain. This is actually the treaty oak in Austin, Texas. Very valuable tree to the city of Austin. It was once a grove of 15 trees that Sam Houston and Stephen Austin had been under, and it was said that Native Americans had met here. So it's a very valuable historic tree. And they wanted to keep people from underneath this tree because there were many defects in the tree, and also to protect the tree from people. And just a side note here, this historic tree was actually poisoned in 1989 by a deranged person. The city was able to bring it back. So you can see the value this tree has to the city of Austin. And so they want to keep it no matter what. So they keep people away from it, and it's there for its historic value. For whole tree failure, you want to have 1 to 1.5 times the height as the radius of the target zone. Why the range? Well, if it's just think if it's a dead tree or it has large dead branches in the top, then if that tree would fall, the branches would break and fly like shrapnel. And so you want to have some sort of buffer. So you give that extra half a tree length to give some buffer in case the tree falls. Let's talk about targets. There's 2 types of targets, static and dynamic. So static target is one that's moving. It's there day and night. It's not moving around. It's not going here and there. Now you could say that's a portable picnic table, but it's not going to move unless a park worker comes and moves it. A car that comes and parks in that parking spot is a dynamic target. It's going to park there. They're going to come and eat their lunch at the picnic table. So both the person and the car are dynamic targets, and they're going to eat their lunch for a half an hour, and then they're going to leave. You can see this tree has some dead wood in the top. So the question is it reasonable to move the target? Well, what would you do here? You could move those picnic tables to the next tree over that does not have dead wood. And then you're not inviting people to sit under a tree that has dead wood. And just doing that, you've reduced your risk. If you wanted to, you could prevent access. You could barricade tape it. You could cone off the parking spaces. You could move the picnic tables and then put barricade tape around it. And then you're preventing access to the target zone.
Okay, and I just want to take this moment to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, you can simply click on the Q&A button and type in your questions at any time, and John can answer questions pertaining to a specific slide or specific area of the presentation that we are going through right now. Go ahead and continue, John.
Thank you, Lisa. That's a good point. Yeah, I can stop anytime and answer questions or clarify anything. And so just to make the point that for there to be risk, you have to have a target. And that's one way of reducing risk is by dealing with targets. Occupancy rate. Now what this is dealing not with the static target, because the static target is occupying that target zone all the time, right? Those picnic tables are constantly under that tree. But people and the car are occupying the target zone for only a portion of time. So the arborist looks at, is the occupancy rate for the target zone rare or occasional, just infrequently? Occasional occupation of the target zone would be like a neighborhood sidewalk. Someone walking down the sidewalk, let's say every 10 minutes, somebody walks underneath that tree. And they're underneath that tree for maybe, what, 10 seconds. And so when you consider that amount of frequency, it's a very small part of the day that there's actually someone underneath that tree, so in the target zone. Now, a frequently occupied target zone would be where maybe you have a busy parking lot that has cars in it all the time. You have a dead tree standing in the parking lot. And even though maybe cars aren't in it at night, but all during the day for 6 days a week, it's occupied, that would be frequent. And then constant, of course, is with static targets. Likelihood of impact. We want to consider the occupancy zones and what's the likelihood, target zones and occupancy levels, I should say. And then what's the likelihood that the failure would impact a target? So very low is that there's really not much chance of the target being impacted. That would be with a very low occupancy rate. Low means that it's not likely. It could, but not likely. Medium is meaning that it's as likely as not to impact the target. So for instance, going back to the parking lot, let's say there's a dead tree on the edge of a parking lot, and on the other side of that tree is a woods with no targets. So that dead tree could either fall into the parking lot when it fails, or it could fall into the woods. So it's as likely as not to hit a target. And that we would define as medium. And so it's, and then high, meaning that it's probably going to hit the target that you're looking at. I can go through an example here. I hope it'll clarify how we do this. So let's look at this tree. This is a tree in a city park that I was evaluating. And you can see here that this definitely has a defect here, right? Large defect, already had a failure of a third of the crown. And this tree is leaning away from us, and it's leaning towards a target there, right? A bench and a street light. Those are both targets. What's another target you can think of here? People, right? That bench is inviting people to sit in the shade on a warm summer day, and people are going to be sitting on that bench and walking down that sidewalk. And this park had a spray pad in the middle of the park, so this is a busy park. People are bringing their kids to it, and they're sitting on the bench waiting for their, while their kids are playing, they're sitting reading a book. And so there's definitely a high use level in this park in the summertime. And so we definitely have targets, and we definitely have a defect, right? So let's look at the, looking back at this, so you know what I would rate this as its likelihood of failure. I wouldn't call this imminent because it wasn't cracking and swinging in the wind. I wasn't afraid to walk under this. But I would say in the next couple of years, I would guess this is probably going to come down. So I would call this a probable likelihood of failure. So if we look at our matrix here, I'm going to show you these matrices, and don't worry about understanding them enough to be able to use them. I just want to show you the process here. So if you look at the top matrix here, the likelihood of failure on the left, we said is probable. And then you go across to the likelihood of impacting the target. Now that limb, when it fails, is going to hit that bench and that light. So that is what we would call a high likelihood of impacting the target. So what we're coming up with is a likely rating here. Now for people aren't on that bench 24/7, but in the summertime they're there a lot, and so we're going to call that medium. We're going to say they're as likely as not. They're not there at night. They're not there early in the morning or late in the evening, but we're going to say that it's a medium rating. So remember those two ratings, likely and somewhat likely. We'll come back to that. So let's look at the consequences of failure. Negligible, low property damage, really no injury at all. Minor means low to moderate property damage, and minor injury. Significant is moderate to high property value and a personal injury, and then severe is serious personal injury or death, high property value damage. So let's look at our example again. If we look at the bench and the light, a bench, what's that, about $1,500 installed, light maybe $6,000. So you got, $7,000 to $8,000 of amenities that would get destroyed if that tree fell. So we're going to call that significant. Depending on your budgets, I don't know if you would call it significant. $8,000 I know to me was $8,000. I could sure use that in ways better than replacing these. And let's look at if a person was on that branch. Well, of course, that's going to be severe. If that branch comes down, that's going to be bad. And that would definitely be a severe consequence if that came down. So we're going to go down to the bottom matrix there. And remember, we said likely and somewhat likely. So the bench was likely category for likely for failure and impact. So if we go across and we say that it was, remember, it was a significant consequence. So this has a high risk rating for the bench. That we're talking about that for the bench and the light. Now for people, we said it was somewhat likely that there would be failure and impact. And we said it would be a severe consequence, right? So this is a moderate risk rating for people for this tree. Now I would call it a high moderate because it's on the high end of the scale. So this tree we would rate as high to high moderate risk rating. And that would go in the report. So the level 1 reports, going back to level 1 reports, remember these reports are dealing with assessing risk in populations of trees. You're going to end up with a list of trees and their defects and the mitigation action that should be taken. So you have a list of trees like you're seeing on the left. You're going to have data that's in there. You're going to have the arborist recommendation for mitigation, and you're going to, because of dead limb, heartwood rot, dead tree, standing dead tree. And then on the right, because you can't get everything done at once, right? If you have a list of trees that have to be mitigated, you're not going to be able to get everything done at once. So you're going to have a prioritized list, and it's going to show that you're using your resources in the best way you're able to take care of risk that's in your urban forest in a way that's manageable and practical with the resources that you have. So for instance, this example says year 1, you're going to priority prune quadrants 1 and 2. Maybe that's the busiest area of town. You're going to do your priority removals. And then you're going to perform your level 2 and 3 risk assessments. And if there's any mitigation resulting from those assessments, you're going to take care of that. And then you might look at year 2. You're going to priority prune quadrants 3 and 4. You can do your standard removals, which were a lower priority. And then any trees that were listed as monitoring, you're gonna have someone check on them to make sure there weren't any changes to their condition. Your level 1 report will also have some mapping that should be done. Now, if you're doing it with a GIS-based system, it's really a good way to go, because you'll end up with mapping such as this. This is one I did for a park district for a park. And these are trees that had defects in them. And it was a busy park with a lot of big trees. And they were able to come up with we were able to recommend prioritized actions that they could take to mitigate risk in this park. The south part of the park had a lot of big trees with dead wood. And then there was actually a tree over a playground that had a branch that was failing, and it was swaying in the wind. It was over the playground. Now it was in the winter, but I did recommend that they would deal with that tree as soon as possible, and they did. And they took care of it. And so they, because of that, they're able to find that imminent hazard, and so it really helped them out. And then they were able to have a prioritized list that they had as a result of the assessment. Now, level 2 and level 3 assessments, remember, these are in individual trees. So there's an ISA track form that's used for individual trees, and the arborist goes through this form and then utilizing the tools and techniques, depending on whether it's a level 2 or level 3 assessment. And then they come up with a risk rating at the end of it. And then from that risk rating, they're also producing mitigation options, and you also get residual risk information from those options. Now, what does residual risk mean? Well, because you're getting options, you're going to have residual risk once you've implemented one of those options. So let's say the option is do nothing for that park tree that we saw that was over the light and bench. The residual risk would be still moderate high to high because nothing was done. And if they would remove the tree, the residual risk would be 0 because the tree has been removed. The defective tree was removed. Now, if it was a tree that just had a weak union over a bench like that, maybe you could prune it and cable it. And then you would have a residual risk of probably low because you reduce the probability that that branch was going to fail. And so this would all be in the level 2 and level 3 reporting. Now, assessment personnel should be ISA certified arborists with tree risk assessment qualifications, TRAC qualifications. TRAC arborists are certified arborists, and they go through classroom lectures in outdoor classrooms utilizing the ANSI standards and the TRAC BMPs, and then they take a written test. And they also have a practical exam where they're actually doing actual assessments. And if they pass, then they can become a TRAC arborist.
John, we do have a question that's come up. They want to know, do you not need to fill out a TRAQ form for a level 1 assessment?
No, you don't. Because what you're doing with the level 1 is you're identifying imminent and probable likelihood of failure trees. And you can do it, but what you're doing is you're elevating it then to a level 2 assessment. And even though, or level 3 if you start using the specialized tools. But what you're actually doing, if you fill out a track form for an individual tree, then you've just elevated it to a level 2 assessment. And going back to the level 1, why we recommend this is because we understand that you can't do level 2 and level 3 assessments on every tree out there, and some are obviously should be dealt with. It's just pruning deadwood. That's usually what most of it is pruning deadwood. And then if we clearly see that this tree, we don't want to have you spend the time and money on us doing a level 3 assessment for a tree that we know should come down. And so that's how we look at it. And that's why we feel the level 1 assessment is a good way to go for looking at large populations of trees. But you certainly can elevate it to a level 2 assessment and use the track form if need be. So, where to start? I know I've given a lot of information, and so the question is, where should you start? And going back, you probably remember I emphasized creating a tree risk policy because it's really the platform from which you create a tree risk management system. And really what the policy, like I said, should state that you're responsible for the care and maintenance of your municipal trees. You understand that you have to balance benefits versus risks that those trees might pose to people and property. It'll also state that you intend to make efforts to identify and manage tree risk, and that you're going to make risk management decisions that are based on the risk levels that you found and your levels of acceptable risk and your budget constraints and other factors that affect your work priorities. Now, I just want to say too that we worked with IRMA. We talked to IRMA regarding what we feel the important points and elements of a tree risk policy should be. And IRMA came up with a boilerplate for you to utilize, which they're providing to you members. And really, really good boilerplate, includes all this. You don't have to write all this down. This is going to be in that boilerplate. And it's going to be, and I would highly recommend that you consider doing that, because it's going to give you a basis for managing risk in your urban forest. So let's talk a little bit more about tree risk policy.
And John, real quick, we
Yeah.
just received another question.
Yes.
I want to ask if residual risk could be shifted to the stump on site after conducting tree removal.
Yes, it could. And what you would do is you would look at, okay, what kind of risk does a stump pose to people and property? And in the track system, we're not looking at ground level hazards, such as a sidewalk that's been uplifted by roots, or a stump that's been left in place that people could trip over. So there would really be then, it would just be categorized as low, because there is no tree there to have a defect to fall on someone. So essentially there's no residual risk as a stump. So the policy statement is going to formalize that you're going to identify trees that are owned and maintained by the municipality. So how do you do that? Well, if you have a current tree inventory, that's a good place to start. That you can state that we're going to utilize the tree inventory to determine the trees that should be assessed. And maybe you haven't done an inventory. You could state something like all municipal or park properties that are maintained are going to be assessed, because there's really no need to assess a woodlot if there's no pathways through it, if people don't go in it. So, but it depends on your community and on your system. You also might have an ordinance that states that adjacent property owners have to maintain municipal trees on rights of way. And then that would be incorporated into that too, that you're not responsible for those trees. It depends on your situation. You also want to state what professional standards you're going to use. And of course, you should use the ANSI A300 standards and ISA BMPs. These are really the internationally used, and these are what should be utilized. You're going to identify and assess potential risk from municipal trees using level 1, 2, and 3 assessments. And you should define that methodology in your policy. You should also identify who's going to conduct risk assessments and how often you're going to conduct them. And I should just emphasize here is don't paint yourself in the corner when you identify who's going to conduct assessments and how often you're going to do it. It'd be great if you can have an in-house arborist that's track qualified, do your assessments, and you want to do it every spring and every fall. But just consider what could happen. Maybe a different arborist is hired that's not track qualified, and then you might have to contract it out. And then maybe you're not actually able, you find you're not actually able to do it every spring and fall. And then you're not meeting your minimum requirements. So make sure it's a standard that you can meet, and you can always exceed that standard. But just don't paint yourself in a corner. Make sure it's a standard that you feel that is reasonable for your agency.
Okay, John, what holds up more prominently in court, tree policy or ordinance? Just a general question to be answered right now.
That is a very lawyerly question, and I'm not able to answer that. I suspect it might be a combination of the two, and they shouldn't contradict one another. That might be an important point to bring up, is make sure your ordinances and policies jive with one another. But I think that's the extent that I could probably delve into that question.
Hi, if I can just jump in and maybe contribute to that a little bit. This is Frankie Gianetti. I'm the loss control manager with IRMA. I think John kind of pointed at this as far as the question, what's of most importance is establishing consistency. So whether you have an ordinance in place or you have a policy in place, really what's going to be vital is establishing all of the components of your tree risk management that John is outlining here, and then making sure that as a municipality that you are sticking to it. So if you do come across a case where liability is in question, the most important thing that's going to be looked at is what you have in place and how closely you followed it.
Thank you, Frankie. So implementing the policy. Define how your assessment findings are going to be reported. Is it going to be a written report that's presented to the municipal forester and is submitted to the public works director? Is it going to be created by your own staff, created by a contracted arborist, or just whatever works best for your system? Identify who's going to determine the risk mitigation options. Will it be recommendations from the arborist to the public works director? And then who's going to prioritize those mitigation options? Is it going to be, the public works director is going to be done by the village arborist, or whatever works for your system? This will be customized for how you get work done. So just a little bit about mitigation. Mitigation options can be barricading the tree, pruning, cabling, bracing the tree, removal of the tree, and other things also, removing targets, things like that. Just a little bit of discussion on timeframes based on the risk rating. Remember, we talked about risk ratings for individual trees. If you have an extreme risk tree, that's one that's in the process of failing, so you want to barricade that. That's why we say as soon as possible, meaning 1 to 2 days. That would be a tree that's in the process of failure where someone could get underneath it. Just barricade tape it and then deal with it as soon as you can. High risk trees should be mitigated as soon as practical. Excuse me. So when work and schedule allows. So it doesn't mean you have to drop everything that second, but what it does mean is you're not going to just wait until you can get around to it. You're gonna finish the job, and then you're gonna get your crew out there and take care of that high risk tree. Moderate risk trees are trees that should be taken care of within the next few months or maybe years, within that time frame that the arborist was talking about of the assessment. So they should be mitigated, but you have a longer time frame in which to do it. And low risk trees, you really don't have to perform any mitigation. That could just be monitored over time. So let's go back to Colorado Springs. I said we'd come back to this, didn't I? So the good news is the city of Colorado Springs actually had done a level 1 assessment on this tree, and they had marked it for removal. They had not gotten around to removing it yet. They had quite a few removals to do. They utilized a combination of in-house staff and contracted service to do the removals. So what they did was they marked it for removal. It was on a list, and they're going to get it taken out. It was unfortunate for the 2 gentlemen who did survive, which was good, that the tree fell when it did, but the city could not have known exactly when that tree was going to fall, and they were doing the best they could with the resources they had to mitigate that risk, and that was by marking it for removal and getting it on the list to have it done. And so as a result, there's no litigation from this incident, and the city was protected. And I just wanted to use this example, not as something to scare anyone, but just to show that being proactive in your risk management really does protect you. And it really makes, like I said, we want to do the best job that we can, right? And so we want to do the best job that we can, and we did all we could to take care of this tree, and just sometimes things happen. And but the city was protected because of the actions and their risk mitigation actions they took this tree. So to summarize, What you want to do is you want to create policies, procedures that show that you want to manage risk in your trees. You want to do a level 1 assessment on your trees to identify potential higher risk trees. And you may have to do higher levels of assessment on certain trees where that's appropriate. Then you want to define what risk mitigation options that you need to take from these assessments. You want to develop a plan, and then you want to implement that plan. And it's very systematic, and it's taking it step by step, and it's understanding that you don't have unlimited resources to take care of everything at once, but you're doing the best you can in order to manage potential risk that's out there. And just want to say that I know it's a lot of information, and we can help you anything you need help with. We can write policies, we can do these risk assessments, we do inventories. We understand that municipalities, some have staff, they're able to do these things, some are not, some don't have enough staff, and we're happy to help. We have a good amount of experience working with public agencies. And that's it for my presentation, and I can take any questions there might be,
Okay. Yes, John, I do have a couple that have popped up. How would you assess a tree that has been completely overtaken with woodpecker holes?
I would say that the woodpecker holes, it probably indicates that there's some level of decay in the tree. I'm just kind of guessing. If there's a lot of that activity on the tree, it's probably a tree that's in decline and has some decay. You might need to have somebody look more closely at that tree. It's a general, I know it's a very general observation there without looking at the tree itself. But yeah, it's probably an indicator that that tree has some problems.
Okay. Does having a tree marked prior to removal, as in the Colorado Spring incident, increase the municipality's liability?
That's actually an excellent question, because I get that all the time, and it's one of the first things that pop into people's minds. And I'll also see if Frankie agrees with this, but what we see, and I know from when I was in Paderma too, ignorance was not a defense. And especially when we're talking about playgrounds, and we remember that with our playgrounds inspections, we did that because we didn't want to be ignorant of the potential risks in a playground just because we didn't know about a problem. We could show that we periodically and regularly inspected our playgrounds. We periodically and regularly inspect our urban forest. We're doing the best we can, and we're utilizing the resources that we have to mitigate risk. And so you can show that, yeah, we did this level 1 assessment. Here's the things we found, and here's what we did. Now, yeah, I know we didn't take care of that 33-inch silver maple, but look at all the other ones we did take care of, and we were moving on to that one. That one was going to be removed in 2 weeks, and so our intent was to mitigate risk as we're able with the budgets that we have. And so I think it's a good defense in order to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Frankie?
Oh, go ahead, John, sorry.
No, I was just asking if you agreed with that.
I do. I think that doing nothing is never better than doing something. Part of the responsibility of the Public Works Director and the department they're overseeing is identifying those hazards. And a part of the components that we built into that model policy with you on tree risk management is really, it's very similar to our sidewalk policy that our steering committee worked on in November, where you're identifying that these issues need to be addressed, but you're also committing addressing those as staff and budget allow. So coming up with a strategy to prioritize those higher risk trees with the staff and budget availability is really the best level of protection over doing nothing. And exactly like you said, claiming ignorance on it isn't going to fly.
Okay, Kevin, Kevin has a question, John. It is, trees fall, public sees it. It can create a high level of fear and potentially cause the professional arborist to put trees at low to medium risk and shift it to a high risk. How have you managed this type of situation?
That's actually an excellent question. One of the things they stress in the track training is what we find when we do actually go through the process is that trees are not as risky as they may seem. Like, you might be surprised in that example I showed in the park over the bench and the light, that tree only rated out as a moderate to moderate high to people. And you look at that tree and you think, oh my goodness, that tree should come out. And it should. But it's really using a very systematic process to determine the real risk to people and property. And it's tempting when, because you look at a defect like that, and people tend to look at it and see the severity of the consequence. Meaning, if that tree falls, that's going to kill somebody, or that's going to hurt somebody really seriously. And so you tend to evaluate the consequence rather than the actual risk. And the reason why that's important is because if you're prioritizing your risk, you don't want to have everything bumped up to a high risk, because that's kind of like doing employee evaluations. We all do employee evaluations, right? And if you bump all those good employees up to the highest level, well, then you can't differentiate between the excellent employee and the good employees. And it's the same thing with trees. If you bump all those trees that have a severe consequence, are kind of a medium to medium high risk, and you bump them up to extreme risk, well, then you're not going to be able to differentiate the one that's actually a high risk. And you're going to start working on the ones that are actually a lower risk to people, and you're going to eventually get to that high risk tree. You won't be able to differentiate. And so that's my argument for sticking to the system and not inching it up because it seems like it should be higher. And it might be difficult to explain to people, but I think the way to explain it to people is we're doing this systematically. We're taking care of other trees first that have a higher rating, and we're going to get to these as soon as we can because of its risk rating that are based on ANSI 300 standards by a professional arborist. And I think you have good ground to stand on.
Okay, we do have another question. We are looking into becoming a Tree City USA and are in the process of developing the relevant ordinance to meet the application requirements. Part of this process is crafting and implementing a plan of work for documenting annual tree care activities. In your opinion, does the tree risk management assessment policy meet these requirements?
I would say it partially does, because you're dealing with the managing the risk found in the urban forest. They're also looking for, what do you do as regular maintenance? Do you have a schedule for pruning? Do you have a cycle of 3 years, 4 years, 7 years for your pruning cycle? And you know, that would probably need to be addressed also, but I think you could use this as a part of it.
Okay, that is great. It doesn't seem like we have any more questions at this time. I know that Irma would like to thank John for presenting this information today. I believe Frankie has a few closing quotes, and then we have some final housekeeping.
I just wanted to know you have one more question that popped up before we close out.
Two more. Okay. The issue I end up having is people don't care about other issues with other trees in our village. They only worry about what is around them. One tree limb falls, and even after inspecting it, they felt unsafe regardless if it was just heavy snow or ice. How would you address this?
Again, a good question, and I understand the public pressure that you end up receiving from certain neighborhoods and certain people, and that can really put the pressure on. And I think you can utilize this to defend your actions. Sometimes you, and I think it gives you a basis to stand on. And I know sometimes you end up having to just bend a little bit and take care of the resident to deal with the issue. But one thing you can do is say, you know what, I have much more urgent issues over here. And we had an arborist look at this, and they determined that that was just a perfectly healthy wind, and that was a wind shear that broke that off. And there's not residual risk from that, or the residual risk is low. You could do a level 2 on it if it was that much of an issue. You could do a level 2 on the tree, and you could end up with a low level of risk, and that might be what I would recommend. It might be worth the few $100s just to get a level 2 done on it, and then you can show the resident that this is poses no more risk than the other trees down the block.
Okay. Are risk assessments usually available to the public or provided as needed? Chicago residents have questioned why some trees have been cut down in their neighborhood but don't know where to look for answers.
Good question. I know when we do our inventories, and which is essentially a level 1 assessment, and usually municipalities and park districts may post information, but they'll only post part of the information, the genus, species, size, not so much condition and work that needs to be done, because it just raises a lot of questions like, well, why are you doing this work? It said you needed to prune my tree and you haven't pruned my tree yet. Or this tree looks like it had some defects and it's been 1.5 years. Why haven't you gotten this yet? I'm sure that if it's FOIA'd, it probably needs to be made available, but I don't know. It really depends on your agency whether you want to open that can of worms by just opening up and making them available without a request.
Okay, I believe that is it as far as questions going. And again, I want to thank everyone for their time. I am very happy that we were able to present this topic despite some of the obstacles that we have had recently with scheduling. So thank you very much for staying with us today. I do want to mention a few things before we leave, that IRMA does have a model policy related to this topic that is available on our website. If you click on the IRMA homepage and go through risk management, we do have best practices and model policies available, and this is one that has been recently updated. So please make sure to look at that for all of your policy needs. Again, we do have CEUs that are available for all of those that have attended this course. Everyone that has attended the entirety of this course will receive a SurveyMonkey to ask your overall evaluation. And then once you receive that SurveyMonkey, there will be a place for you to input your certification number. Once you do that, John will submit those numbers into ISA, and you will receive credit for attending this webinar. If there's nothing else that John or Frankie would like to add at this time.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, everyone, we'd like to thank you again for attending, and remember to stay safe. Have a great day.